Ringo Starr was not the first choice when the Beatles began their journey. In the early days, the band already had a drummer, Pete Best, but something was missing. When Ringo joined in 1962, everything changed. His drumming style wasn't flashy, but it had a unique swing that perfectly fit the band's sound. The Beatles didn't need a drummer who showed off. They needed someone who could blend rhythm with melody, someone who made the music feel complete. That was Ringo. From the start, critics underestimated him. They saw John Lennon and Paul McCartney writing the hits, George Harrison adding brilliant guitar, and Ringo sitting quietly at the back. Many journalists called him the luckiest man in show business. To them, he was simply in the right place at the right time. But musicians knew better. Behind the simple image was a drummer with incredible timing and instinct. Ringo had the gift of knowing when not to play, leaving space in the music that made the Beatles sound bigger than they were. Still, doubts followed him. In the 1960s, drummers were beginning to step into the spotlight. Bands like the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, and the Who showed off players who were louder, faster, and more aggressive. Ringo's calm, song-focused drumming seemed too safe compared to the storm-building in rock music. Whispered questions started to spread. Was Ringo really good enough? Was he holding the Beatles back? Fans rarely saw the pressure he carried. On stage, he smiled, twirled his sticks, and kept the beat steady through the screams of thousands of fans. In the studio, he created rhythms that no other drummer would have thought of. Ticket to Ride had a pounding, unique beat. Rain showed off his creativity with drums that almost sounded like thunder. He wasn't just a background player. He was shaping the future of drumming. But Ringo also knew that comparisons were inevitable. Other drummers were gaining fame as stars in their own right, and one man in particular would soon be placed against him. That man's name would follow Ringo for the rest of his career. The seeds of a rivalry had been planted, one that would define how the world judged Ringo Starr forever. While Ringo Starr was holding his place as the heartbeat of the Beatles, another drummer was rising across the Atlantic. His name was Keith Moon, the explosive force behind the Who. If Ringo was calm and steady, Keith was the complete opposite. Wild, unpredictable, and untamed. On stage, Keith didn't just play the drums. He attacked them. He smashed cymbals, pounded his kit with insane energy, and sometimes even destroyed his own set by the end of a show. Audiences had never seen anything like him before. Keith's style made him the new face of rock drumming. He turned concerts into a spectacle where the drummer wasn't hidden at the back but stood out as the star. Music magazines began calling him a genius. Fans compared him to a storm. Loud, dangerous, but impossible to look away from. And while Keith's fame grew, Ringo was still seen as the quiet Beatle, the one who never fought for attention. It didn't take long before comparisons started. Writers asked the question, who was the better drummer, Ringo Starr or Keith Moon? To many, Keith seemed like the obvious answer. His style was bold and exciting, while Ringo's playing was more controlled. Some critics claimed Ringo lacked skill, saying almost anyone could do what he did. But those who truly understood music knew it wasn't so simple. The rivalry wasn't personal in the beginning. In fact, Ringo and Keith admired each other. They became friends, sharing late nights, laughter, and drinks. Keith loved the Beatles and often joked that he wanted to be part of the band. Ringo, on the other hand, was amazed by Keith's raw energy, even if it was the complete opposite of his own. But no matter how close their friendship was, the world insisted on painting them as rivals. Every time Ringo played, the comparisons echoed in his mind. He wasn't just drumming for the Beatles anymore. He was drumming under the shadow of Keith Moon. Fans, critics, and fellow musicians were waiting to see if he could prove himself. For Ringo, it became less about keeping time and more about keeping respect. The rivalry was growing louder, and soon it would explode into the biggest debate rock music had ever seen. What makes a drummer truly great? By the mid-1960s, the rivalry between Ringo Starr and Keith Moon had become the talk of the music world. The Beatles were recording groundbreaking albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, pushing the limits of what rock music could be. Ringo's drumming played a hidden but vital role in that success. He wasn't flashy, but his rhythms were creative and unusual. On songs like Rain, His drumming rolled and tumbled in ways no one expected. On Tomorrow Never Knows, he played with such precision that the entire psychedelic sound rested on his beat. Musicians who studied these tracks began to realize just how skilled he really was. Yet in the public eye, Keith Moon was stealing the spotlight. With The Who's explosive live shows, he seemed like a force of nature. Fans watched in awe as Keith played at lightning speed, arms flying, drums crashing like thunder. He was more than a musician. He was chaos turned into sound. Rock magazines called him the most exciting drummer alive, and some even said he had reinvented drumming itself. This created a strange kind of drama. Ringo was in the biggest band on earth, yet Keith was seen by many as the better drummer. The debate divided fans. Some argued that Ringo wasn't technical enough, that he was only famous because of the Beatles. Others defended him, saying Keith was wild, but Ringo was musical, playing exactly what each song needed. For Ringo, the rivalry wasn't just about Keith Moon. It was about identity. He had always played for the music, never to show off, but in a world where louder and faster often meant better, his subtlety was misunderstood. The comparison began to weigh on him. He couldn't ignore the constant chatter that he was the wackest Beatle. Every review, every article seemed to remind him that someone else was being celebrated as the greatest drummer in rock. But Ringo had something Keith didn't. He had the chance to prove himself in the most famous recordings ever made. Every time he stepped into Abbey Road Studios, he left behind drum parts that would inspire generations. The world might have been watching Keith Moon burn bright, but Ringo Starr was quietly building a legacy that would outlast the noise. Away from the flashing lights and screaming fans, the story of Ringo Starr and Keith Moon looked very different. They were not bitter enemies, as the press often suggested, but two men who shared a unique bond. Both were drummers living in the madness of fame. Both carried the pressure of being compared, and both knew what it meant to have the world watching their every move. Instead of clashing, they often spent time together, drinking, joking, and supporting each other in ways only musicians could understand. Keith admired Ringo deeply. To him, Ringo wasn't just a drummer. He was part of the band that had changed music forever. Keith often said he would have loved to be a Beatle, not for the fame, but for the magic of being inside their creative circle. Ringo, on the other hand, looked at Keith with a mix of wonder and caution. He admired his raw fire on stage, but also saw the danger in the chaos that seemed to follow Keith everywhere. Behind closed doors, Keith battled his own demons. His lifestyle was extreme, filled with heavy drinking, drug use, and wild behavior that pushed his body to the edge. Ringo had his struggles too, but he carried them differently. His humor and laid-back nature often shielded him from complete collapse. Still, the constant comparisons weighed on him. He once admitted that the criticism of his drumming stayed with him for years, even when he laughed it off in public. The rivalry was never truly between Ringo and Keith. It was between what they represented. Keith was the symbol of speed, power, and madness. Ringo was the face of steadiness, reliability, and musical balance. One burned like fire, the other beat like a steady heart. The fans and critics turned this contrast into competition, even when the two men themselves did not. But the pressure shaped Ringo in a powerful way. He realized he didn't need to outplay Keith or become something he was not. His strength was in knowing his role, in being the drummer who made a song breathe. While Keith lit stages on fire, Ringo built timeless rhythms that would live forever on vinyl. The world may have been obsessed with chaos, but behind the curtain, Ringo Starr was quietly proving that subtlety could be just as powerful. In 1978, the rivalry between Ringo Starr and Keith Moon ended in the most heartbreaking way possible. Keith Moon, the thunder behind The Who, died at just 32 years old. His body had finally given up after years of heavy drinking, drug use, and a lifestyle that never slowed down. The rock world was stunned. One of its brightest flames had burned out far too soon. For fans, Keith's death cemented his legacy. He became the symbol of a generation that lived fast, played hard, and left behind stories as wild as the music itself. People remembered his chaos, his genius, and his unforgettable energy. But for Ringo Starr, Keith's passing was deeply personal. He had not only lost a rival in the public's eyes, but also a friend. The man who had often been compared to him was gone, leaving behind silence where there had once been thunder. After Keith's death, the debate between the two drummers changed. It was no longer about who was better. It became about what they stood for. Keith was remembered as the fire that burned too quickly, a shooting star who dazzled but could not last. Ringo, on the other hand, became the survivor. He carried on, continuing to play, laugh, and live long after the Beatles had ended. With time, people began to look at Ringo differently. They started to appreciate what he had always brought to the music. His drumming wasn't about destruction or spectacle. It was about giving songs the heartbeat they needed. Musicians from later generations, from Phil Collins to Dave Grohl, spoke out about Ringo's importance. They explained that his style was not simple. It was genius in disguise. Without Ringo, the Beatles would not have sounded the same. Keith's fall had unintentionally lifted Ringo higher. The rivalry that once seemed to overshadow him now worked in his favor. Fans realized that Ringo's strength was in his endurance, his discipline, and his ability to keep music alive without burning himself out. Keith became the legend of chaos, and Ringo became the proof that steady, humble artistry could last a lifetime. The battle between them had ended, but its lessons were only beginning. For Ringo, Keith's tragic fate was a reminder that survival was also a kind of victory. Today, when people look back at the story of Ringo Starr, the rivalry with Keith Moon feels less like a contest and more like a powerful lesson. Ringo proved something that critics once refused to see: that greatness does not always roar like thunder. Sometimes greatness whispers. Sometimes it beats steadily in the background, holding everything together. For years, Ringo was labeled the luckiest Beatle, a man who simply happened to be in the right band at the right time. But history has been kind to him. Musicians now openly call him one of the most influential drummers of all time. His ability to play exactly what a song needed, not too much, not too little, changed the way rock music was built. His style inspired generations who understood that drumming is not about being the loudest in the room, but about making music breathe. Keith Moon, his great rival and friend, remains remembered as the wild genius who burned out too soon. He showed the world the extremes of drumming, how chaos could become art. But his legacy also carried a warning about the dangers of living too fast. Ringo, in contrast, became the example of survival. He lived long enough to see his contributions respected, celebrated, and loved. He became the last drummer standing, the quiet fighter whose steady beat outlasted the storm. Even now, debates continue about who was the better drummer, but perhaps that was never the point. Keith and Ringo represented two different sides of rock and roll, the fire and the heartbeat. One could not replace the other, because both defined what it meant to be a drummer in their own way. Together, their rivalry gave the world a deeper understanding of music, artistry, and endurance. Ringo Starr's true rival was never just Keith Moon. His real battle was against doubt, against the critics who dismissed him, and against the shadow of being underestimated. And in the end, he won that battle. He proved that a drummer doesn't need to be the loudest or the wildest to be unforgettable. All they need is to be true to the song, and true to themselves. That is Ringo Starr's legacy. Not just the drummer of the Beatles, not just the man in the background, but the quiet fighter who kept the beat of history alive.